May I have your attention, please? Thank you. I'm going to tell you a few little stories about what we're up to at the Witte, and I'm not a historian, and I'm not an archaeologist, but we have historians and archaeologists in this room that have done a lot of this work, so I'm talking on their behalf. But before we do anything, we do have a little bit of history we want to revisit, and that is our 2020 Trailblazer of the Year. Graham Weston has arrived. Sorry, I got you. But Graham, could you stand up so we can applaud you? We were saying, Graham, that you were applauded last year, but it was complete silence because it was virtual. So here we are. So glad you're here. So today, we are literally gathering at the waters for this conference. As you look out along the San Antonio River, behind me and next to you, you can see the river bottom pecan trees, the huisach, and the bushes full of berries, even after that crazy storm in February. It's so dreadful, but they've come back. But I want to let you know that people have been gathering here along this river and then along this place for more than 10,000 years. And we know that because we have evidence of stone points from thousands of years. They gathered here for this habitation to hunt white-tailed deer, bobcat, raccoon, rabbits, snakes, lizards, frogs, turkeys, turtles. Every time I say that, it's hard because I think they're so lovely, and I couldn't eat one myself. We know from excavations that bison, pronghorn, antelope, bear, wolf, and mountain lions were also present here. Just north of the Witte Museum, the springs bubble up from the Edwards Aquifer, called the Blue Hole, and that forms the San Antonio River. These lush springs brought people to settle and trade, as you can see. This is a piece that was commissioned by the Witte by an artist named Frank Weir. And you can see the indigenous people from the coast, probably Karankawa, came with shells and large seabirds. This is a whooping crane, I believe. And people from here, mainly the Paia, but many other indigenous groups offered fur and pecans in return. But this dynamic change in the late 1600s, as we all know, when the Spanish met the Paia and all the other hundreds of indigenous groups at the bend, really the Paia they would have met here at the first bend of the San Antonio River at the edge of the Witte property. But by 1719, an enormous diversion dam and a 16-foot wide acequia, or water ditch, was built right here. You can kind of see the edges with the stones we put out there. And it went all the way down, flowing along the watershed, feeding the small Spanish farms along the way, and eventually to Mission de Valero, now the Alamo, where the indigenous families began to live. This year's conference focuses on this transition from Tejas to Texas, the state we live in today. We use the word Tejas in this conference to signify the encounter of the indigenous people and the Spanish in the 16th century. Now, this is all history I know you know, because if you're Texan, you took Texas history in 4th and 7th grade. If you're not Texan and you don't know your Texas history, you are not as well liked as you ought to be, and so you find out about Texas right away, as soon as you can. So I know you know this, but I'm going to, for the context of this conference, I want to say a little bit. We've already noted about San Antonio for thousands of years that what we now call Texas, that people lived along these many rivers and the Gulf Coast, speaking hundreds of languages, gathering again with the pecans, when the pecans were plentiful and when the prickly pear tuna was ripe. It is the indigenous people, actually, who taught the immigrants of the next 500 years how to understand the flora and fauna of what was then called Tejas. From the 17th century onward, Tejas became Texas with bountiful farms, vast ranches, and villages that became towns and cities with skirmishes and bloody battles to establish national dominance, including the 1813 Battle of Medina and the 1836 Battle of the Alamo on land here in Bexar County, those two alone here. The city of San Antonio, once the center of the frontier, became established as a place of confluence. with second and third generation mission Indians still living along the San Antonio River and within the 5 missions, then the Spanish, the German, Italian, Mexican, and an array of people from throughout the United States. Today, in a predominantly urban Texas, and cities in addition to San Antonio, and I think they're called Austin, Houston, Dallas. But anyway, we are all recalibrating how we live on the land, shape the water, and access the night sky. Given that the Witte Museum is where nature, science, and culture meet, the old and the new versions of Texas are critical to comprehend as we shape the future of Texas together. This is actually an auspicious time for the Witte, not because we're almost post-pandemic. It's because next year in 2022, the Robert J. and Helen C. Clayburgh South Texas Heritage Center will be 10 years old. This is a time we take to recalibrate the historical narrative with the latest scholarship infusing those changes. And we thank each one of our scholars presenting at this conference as they help us understand what that means and how we can make sure that our future children, or our children now and their children, can understand Texas in the largest context possible. We ask you all in this audience, as you listen to these scholars, that you'll help us shape the exhibition, the things that you think are most interesting and important for us to share. In a little while, acclaimed author Stephen Harrigan, over here, will speak about his seminal Texas book, Big Wonderful Thing, A History of Texas. And we at the Witte especially love the quote he chose for the cover of the book, which underscores the focus on the natural world of Texas. Artist George O'Keeffe's first impression of the Lone Star State, quote, "I couldn't believe it was real, the same big wonderful thing that oceans and the highest mountains are." Yet, it's kind of ironic, too, because since we don't have oceans like the West and the East Coast, and we don't have the highest mountains, this quote leaves us to think, well, what is Texas? And at the Witte, we reveal Texas through the lens of Texas Deep Time, which pushes us to address the land, the sky, and the water of Texas as unique, as in only in Texas. And I think that's what Stephen's giant book is about. Finally, the last thing I'll say, selected titles of the panels purposely address these new thoughts on Texas and what we're seeking for a future narrative. And some of them are, I'm not reading all of them, The Saga of Cabeza de Vaca, Useful Wild Plants, First Encounters Between Church Missionaries and the Indians, How the Battle of Medina Influenced the Battle of the Alamo, The Chandler Boundary Survey, Black Cowboys, Women Ranchers, Juneteenth, American Tacos, Space Cowboys. So for one, I can't wait to hear all the great research that we're going to share at this conference in Texas. And as important, after experiencing the conference, either in person or remote, please let us know what you wish to see in a future exhibit. So that's my context for the conference. And now it is my great pleasure to present the Texas Trailblazers Award to Mike Bollner and the Bollner family. And the way this is going to go is that Mike Bollner is going to come up here, and I'm going to read something about you first, and then you're going to come up. And then after the luncheon, I want all the Bollner family here, and we have a wonderful photographer who's going to take your portrait as family. So, but first, let me talk a little bit about Mike. Mike, being the historian that he is, will present the inspiring history of the entire Bollner family, which will illustrate clearly why we chose this legacy family to receive the Trailblazers Award as we explore the themes of Tejas to Texas. The Bollner family, as you'll see these wonderful photographs, exemplifies the Texas journey. The Bollner family is integrally involved in the Witte Museum. Bollner Fiesta Products has supported Witte's signature Free Tuesday program for 30 years, making sure we have thousands of people, even right now, come to every Free Tuesday with their families. Generations have grown up at the Witte during these Free Tuesdays, thanks to Bollner Fiesta Products. Tim and Judy Bollner named the road in front of the Witte Curiosity Lane. They invested in the Witte's collections repository, named the Ocelot, Ollie the Ocelot, named the iconic elephants, Cinnamon Candy and Doodle Dandy, and have purchased countless auction items. Chris and Magdalena have served on Witte and Quillen Society and Game Dinner committees. Jeff and Kathy Bollner have served as Game Dinner co-chairs, along with the Sigmans, raising more than $1 million in 2019. So this whole family, and I've actually missed a couple, because I was talking to a couple today, and there's some other Bollners who've been integral as the Witte has grown, and I want to thank all of them. Today, I'm going to focus a little bit because Mike's going to talk about all of you, but my great pleasure is to tell you about Mike Bollner, our leader at the Witte for many years. Mike Bollner was on the board of trustees and on the executive committee when I became president and CEO. He immediately took on the role of my mentor, thank goodness. He organized a luncheon with his dad, Cliff Bollner, and Curtis Gunn, among many Witte leaders, and he made it clear that they would continue to support the Witte. But at this luncheon, it was also made clear that we really needed to tell the city that this is a city museum, because somehow the city of San Antonio had forgotten that about 15 years ago. And so these leaders told me, this is the People's Museum, go remind the city that it's the city museum. And so Mike helped me organize a group of trustees. We visited City Hall, and it turns out very few did know that this was actually city property in the city museum. And so at the end of that process, they didn't know that we were actually City Museum since 1926. And we said, it's kind of fallen apart. This is before the new Witte. And we sort of need some funds for deferred maintenance. And in your city charter, that's one of the roles that you have. And so sure enough, they opened their wallets, thanks to Mike Bollner and Cliff Bollner and all those wonderful leaders. And we have received quite a bit of support from the city of San Antonio after those series of meetings. Also in the beginning, when challenges emerged periodically, when he was chair of the board of the Witte, Michael would gather the trustees to seek consensus on how to move forward. And the board responded to his leadership easily because he was prepared, he was fair, and he was open to suggestions. And when the Witte was considering major exhibitions, and this was the most fun, Mike and Mary Pat, Peggy Walker, and I would take off to visit the exhibits in museums elsewhere to make sure they were good for San Antonio. Mike also joined Ralph Voigt, then VP of Visitor Experience, to check out exhibits throughout the country. If they passed muster, we would grab them to ensure San Antonio families and school children had the same great experience as every city. And that was a goal for Mike. When the Witte was about to embark on choosing contractors for the new Witte, Mike and Mary Pat joined me in Washington, D.C. for the Building Museums Conference. Mike toured the massive Smithsonian storage facility while I listened to panels on business plans and project managers. He definitely got the best part of that journey. But as a result of Mike's findings and quiet urgings, the board supported the renovation of what is now called the B. Naylor Morton Research and Collection Center. Thank you, Susan, for that, named after her father. And then the board also supported the purchase of an off-site facility for the Witte, now almost a state and federal repository. Without Mike Bollner's vision and generous support with every purchase, we could not have moved the Witte team to the research center while building the Witte, nor could we have moved the 320,000 artifacts and specimens from the Witte if we did not have an off-site storage facility. So all of those are pretty important. We're so proud that the children and families take their Witte experience with them when they purchase items in the museum, in the Bollner Family Museum store. And in 2018, when the American Alliance of Museums Accreditation site reviewers toured the Susan Naylor Center, the B. Naylor Morton Research and Collection Center, and the off-site repository, they were astonished at the quality and efficiency. The Witte thinks big, they wrote, and acts on those big ideas. We credit Mike Bollner with the advocating for museum best practices and for supporting those improvements in the Witte. Yes, it is true that the Bollner family, the entire Bollner family, are trailblazers in San Antonio and beyond, and internationally, in so many ways historically and today, and that Bollner Fiesta products fill the cabinets of all of our kitchens. Thank goodness, what will we do without them? I wanted to make sure to take this opportunity also to make a case for Mike Bollner as the museum trailblazer. Mike, we know you're a world traveler and a lifelong learner, and we're so grateful to have you infuse your knowledge in the Witte, which will serve your grandchildren and the grandchildren of all San Antonio and Texas families. Please come up here and to get your award. So thank you, Ryan Berg, for this very creative, fabulous award for Mike. Mike is going to talk about his illustrious family, so I will see you in a moment.
Maurice, thank you very much. Of course, the Bollner family is very honored and humbled to receive this award in conjunction with some of the past recipients that are here. Everything you talked about is truly a group effort, though, which has led to the Witte having the facilities in the great shape they're here today and the great venue we have to use. It all starts with a great staff, wonderful volunteers, docents, researchers, terrific visitors, and of course, our donors. I want to thank them all. As Marie said, I'm going to spend some time talking about how the Bollner family came to San Antonio, which eventually led to my dad's founding of the Bollner's Fiesta Spice Company, and then starting the family legacy here at the Witte. To understand how the Bollners got here, let's go back to pre-1849, when the family lived in Austria after coming there from Switzerland in the 1500s. One of the results of the 1849 First War of Italian Independence was the area they lived in Austria became Italian again. So we went from being Swiss to Austrian to Italian in about 300 years. And I guess that's why we like chocolate, wine, and spaghetti so much. Then in 1881, the current family's great-great-grandparents, Antonio and Joseph Bollner, with their 4 children, their mother, and 2 siblings, 9 in all, traveled from Tyrol, Italy, to Veracruz, Mexico, as requested by President Diaz of Mexico, to tend crops in the country's prime farming area. President Diaz wanted to bring modern European farming methods to the breadbasket of Mexico. He contracted with the government of Italy for farming families to come to Mexico to work the fields. The Bollners were in the 3rd group of almost 100 families that came over to do that. By the time the Bollners got here, however, the locals were getting wary and tired of the outsiders in their homeland, and violence began to break out. As the trouble escalated, the Italian families were released from their contracts, and most left the area. A few Bollners are still in the area. But of the ones who left and came to the United States, 2 of the siblings and their mother went to California. The other ones came to San Antonio. The 2 Bollner brothers eventually married 2 sisters. So we had a lot of double cousins back then, and we still do. Even 23andMe gets confused by all that. After getting married, the oldest brother Antonio and his wife settled in Del Rio as farmers on Bollner Lane, and that street is still there. His oldest daughter married John Quaglia, who started the Val Verde Winery, which is the oldest continuously operating winery in Texas, in Del Rio, still there. The last child, Joe, when he got married in San Antonio, he continued working on the family farm out near Mission Espada. He eventually left the farm and opened a general store in 1909 in downtown San Antonio. 5 years later, 1914, he built the meat market building, which still stands out on South Florida Street. The upstairs of that building, they raised 8 children. My grandfather was one of the 8 children. My mother's family, the Richters, came from Germany to Fredericksburg, Texas via Baltimore, Maryland, after leaving Germany in 1850. Eventually, traveling to the German settlement in Fredericksburg in 1877, my great-grandfather opened a small bakery. But unfortunately, or maybe not so unfortunately, he was not successful. Apparently, there were very few self-respecting German housewives up there that would buy factory-made bread when they could make it cheaper at home. So in 1879, great-grandpa took the last 25-cent coin, the last quarter out of the till, it was a bakery, hopped on a wagon filled with cowhides, became the pastry chef at the Minger Hotel. He really wanted to be a baker, though, so he found a job at the Solskjaer Bakery around the corner from the Minger, married Solskjaer's daughter, borrowed $200 from him, and opened up Richter's Bakery in 1882 with a $200 IOU. You know that brand still exists, Richter's Buttercrust Bread, still exists. And my grandmother Richter's descendants were from the Canary Island group that came to the Presidio of San Antonio in 1731, also via Veracruz, Mexico. I guess without Veracruz, Mexico, we wouldn't be having lunch today here. But 16 generations later, we had Eileen Chavez, my grandmother, who married Otto Richter, my grandfather. And they actually eloped. So both sets of grandparents eloped. I don't know. Anybody else have that? Both sets of grandparents eloped? All right, we'll talk about the Spice Company a little bit. My dad, Clifton, worked at the Boulder Family Market in high school and for a while in college, after college. Got married in 1949, started the family. As that family grew, he went and searched for another job, and after looking around, he decided to get in the spice business, and that was 1955. The building that housed that first company still exists today and is right across the interstate highway from the current factory. The current building was started in 1963 and added on to 5 times over the years into what it is. And the company also owns a finished goods warehouse just to the west of the plant. The company grew in the operation it is today with a lot of hard work, good products, and good service. And with 7 kids, Dad had 7 kids. I'm the oldest of the bottom 6, by the way. Now, I'm not sure how Dad had time to do what he did. He operated a poultry processing plant for a short time, as well as distribution of frozen turkey, chicken, and seafood, all of which complemented the spice factory. However, he always showed up at the band concert, the school plays, the baseball games, the recitals for all his kids. How he did it, I don't know. I have 3 kids and I can't do it. So today, Dad is 92 years old. He doesn't come to the office anymore. And I read the speech to him last night. He made a few comments. That's right. That's, you know. But he keeps up with the main stuff. And, you know, he still asks the questions you don't want to answer. You know, what are you doing about, well, you know, it's on my desk. I'm working on it. What are you going to say? Anyway, today, the 4 of his 7 children and 5 of his 18 grandchildren work at the plant, working to service retail, food service customers, industrial customers, portion packing, custom blending, and private label business across the United States. Just about spices, there are really about 60 spices in the world. And so if you grind them up, you have 120 things to work with, whole and ground. Then you can mix them up and start blending, and you have unlimited palette of things you can get into. And then you pack up in a half-ounce package, a 1 ounce, an 8-ounce bottle, a 1 pound bottle, a 5-pound jug, a 25-pound pail, or a 200-pound barrel. Anyway, you end up with like 3,500 line items. And they manufacture about 1 million packages a week down there. It's quite an operation. The interest in the Witte Museum was instilled in us in a very early date. As kids, we came to see the rocks, the butterflies, the petrified tree. It's still out here. Watched the paddle boats on the river back then. You learned some Texas history. You watched the alligators over here. And you studied the cars and trucks at the car exhibit. It was great. We attended camps, lectures, special exhibits, art classes, whatever they were doing down here. It seems my wife, Mary Pat, and I were in one of those art classes back in kindergarten at age 6. After I got married, I'm at my in-laws' house, and there's this picture on the wall, this little boy in a ball. And I said, that looks familiar to me. Well, sure enough, I had the same picture. We painted that picture in kindergarten at the Ruiz house right over here a few years back. It just goes to show you never know what you're going to find out about. I particularly liked the gun and rock collection as a kid. It was a sad day in 1968 when the McFarland diamond was stolen from the exhibit up here. Interestingly, when we were in Cape Town, South Africa a couple of years ago at the Cape Town Diamond Museum, there was an exhibit about stolen diamonds. And guess what was on that list? The McFarland diamond is one of the largest diamonds stolen and never recovered. And if anybody that came through the airport the last couple of days, the airplane hanging on the ceiling there above the United ticket counter, that belongs to the Witte Museum. It's one of the Witte's part of our exhibit. Anyway, Dad joined the Witte between 1975 and 2001. He worked at the Witte here, serving as advisor, committee member, board member, executive committee, board chair. And he was the first chair of the new Witte after the split with the Art Museum. When those 2 museums split, he was the first chairman here at the Witte. And then as Maurice talked about during my tenure on the board, as the Witte grew, it became apparent we needed to expand the campus and the audience, and the idea of the current campus evolved and was executed. And by the way, there's still naming opportunities available if anybody's interested to come see us. Again, I do want to thank Maurice and her staff for this excellent luncheon today and putting together the conference on Texas, which you will find very, very interesting. So please enjoy the 2 days we have together on campus. It's a beautiful place. And be sure to stop in at the Bowler Family Store before you leave, okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Witte. 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 Thank you, Mr. Witte.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce the introducer. It'll just take a second. But I do want to say one thing about Dan. We're so happy to have him here. Sorry. I'm gonna find my place. Oh, Mike, I've got your talk. Okay, hold on a minute. Sorry. Here we go. So please help me welcome Dan Goodgame, editor-in-chief of Texas Monthly. Dan, if you could come take the stage to introduce keynote speaker Stephen Harrigan. You know, as Dan takes the stage or comes here, let's acknowledge how spectacular Texas Monthly has become under his leadership, right? I mean, it's just amazing. So I, for one, cannot wait for my Texas Monthly issue to come each month so I can curl up in the living room, my favorite chair. I realize a lot of you are reading it digitally, but I'm very old-fashioned and I like my magazine. We shouldn't be surprised at this tremendous increase in quality. Dan is a veteran and legendary journalist, writing among and editing the best journalists of our lifetime, and he's interviewed 6 presidents, numerous luminaries. He's written very interesting and sobering books. And as Graham, Weston, and Dirk know, Dan also served as vice president for executive communications for Rackspace. And most important of all, he lives here with Marcia in San Antonio. And we always love having you here at the Witte Museum. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Maurice, and thanks to your staff. Always a pleasure to be in this handsome facility and, with the great audiences that it attracts. I see a lot of friends and neighbors out there, so thank y'all for coming. And especially to be here today with Steve Harrigan, who is a treasure for Texans and also for people around the world who are trying to figure out what the hell we're up to. Steve is the author of 11 books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Gates of the Alamo, which I imagine many here have read, and 2 other acclaimed historical novels, Remember Ben Clayton and A Friend of Mr. Lincoln. His nonfiction books include the recent Big Wonderful Thing, The History of Texas, and a collection of essays entitled The Eye of the Mammoth. His latest novel, The Leopard is Loose, will be published next January, and Steve informed me this afternoon that he's done with it. Moving on to the next thing. He has written scripts for many TV movies, and as an act of charity on his part, he is a writer-at-large for Texas Monthly, still contributes pieces to us. Careful readers will probably have noticed that during the pandemic, Steve took up a new hobby, and he has been sculpting figures that can charitably be described as whimsical. And I find that whenever you're dealing with anybody as brilliant as Steve, it's reassuring to find that he's not good at every damn thing, Those of you who have read Big Wonderful Thing know what a delight it is. Those of you who haven't may be a little intimidated by the throw weight of the thing. I mean, that sounds like a good watermelon, doesn't it? So I want to give you a pro tip. Jump around in it. Read it as a collection of magazine pieces, because one of the brilliant things that Steve did when he was designing this book and constructing it is that it's written. Each chapter is kind of like a standalone magazine article, and so if you're like me and you felt like you knew enough about Cabeza de Vaca, but you wanted to read more about the Texas Rangers, you can kind of jump to that part. And each chapter, fits with the one before and after, but also kind of stands alone on its own. So don't be intimidated by that. Like the best of the new historians, Steve tells fascinating stories of characters, including many women, who have been overlooked by other writers. And I think that's one of the great benefits of the book. And like the best of the classical historians, Steve has the humility and the discipline to avoid imposing today's mores on people who lived hundreds of years before us. And, when Steve was working on the book, and he and I were talking about that, he said, if I had lived back at that time, I'm sure I'd have been just like them, and so would you. And I think that's right. That's another great value of the book. And finally, I would say that when Steve writes about a place, even a desolate place, the chances are he's been there. He's walked the ground, usually several times, and you can feel that in the confidence and the knowing tone of the writing. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Steve Harrigan.
Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate that. And as somebody who's written for Texas Monthly since 1973, which is almost 50 years now, I'm so proud and grateful to you for the stewardship that you brought to the magazine. It's really, none of us thought when the magazine began that it would last more than 6 months. and you know, there's been so many high quality people, especially including Dan, who have kept this thing going and kept it alive, and I'm really grateful. I'm also grateful for this invitation to speak at the Witte today. Thank you, Maurice and Mary Margaret. This is a place that I've never lived in San Antonio, but I've been coming here since I was 7 years old. And I remember vividly the alligator gardens that were nearby and all the old wagons and stuff that were here at the time. They had a huge impression on me. And thank you and congratulations to the Boldner family for your stewardship of this place, which is really remarkable. And this is such an exciting conference that's going to take place this weekend. So many interesting topics and discussions you guys are going to have. I'm really, really looking forward to that. I was asked to talk a little bit about my latest book, which, as you can see from the slides around here, is called Big Wonderful Thing. And Maurice has told you where that quote comes from. It's from Georgia O'Keeffe. I couldn't believe Texas was real, she wrote to a friend back in the East Coast. The same big wonderful thing as the oceans and highest mountains are. O'Keeffe moved to Amarillo in 1912. She was the drawing supervisor in the public school there, and she came back again a few years later to live a little bit south in Canyon on the edge of the Palo Duro Canyon, where she was the sole art teacher at West Texas State Normal College. While she was there, she painted a series of paintings called Light Coming on the Plains, where she began to experiment with color and to begin to explore her style, which we're also familiar with today. You can go to Canyon today and drive along the residential streets, and you'll come across this house, an unremarkable sort of prairie-style house. And you can't go in, but you can stand in the front yard, and you can look up at that second-floor dormer window and see the room where Georgia O'Keeffe lived when she was a young art teacher. And you can see that it faces east toward Palo Duro Canyon. And that was where she began. She would wake up every morning with the sun rising over the canyon and began to paint this remarkable series of paintings, which led to her remarkable career. We went round and round about what would be a good title for this book, but finally that quote from Georgia O'Keeffe really did it for me, because it suggested to me someone opening their eyes for the first time to Texas and really discovering it and understanding what it was and what it held. And so when it became time to write this book, I knew there was a lot. It's a big state, a lot to write about, and it took me about 6 years of constant travel and constant reading. Here's a picture of my desk as I was working on the book and despairing one day if I could ever possibly wrangle all this material into one volume. And as I said, it's a gigantic story. It goes all the way from there's prehistory, which Maurice and everyone here knows well, and the White Shaman mural and all the rock art along the Pecos and Rio Grande. But the written history begins roughly with Cabeza de Vaca's arrival on the Texas coast in 1528, and ends roughly with Rick Perry on Dancing with the Stars. And so I can't walk you through the whole history of Texas today, nor would you want me to. But I thought I would talk about a few of the things that I encountered that made the greatest impression on me. And I'll start with this place, which is, I think, Maurice, you were talking about the desolate landscape of Texas sometimes. Here is an unremarkable place. This is a scraggly little meadow on a little bluff above Garcetas Creek at the edge of Matagorda Bay. And you wouldn't know it by looking at it, but this is one of the most important sites in Texas history. This is where the explorer La Salle came in 1684, sailing from France. He meant to establish a colony in Spanish Texas, a French colony in Spanish Texas, at the mouth of the Mississippi River. But he overshot the Mississippi. He ended up on Garcetas Creek at Matagorda Bay and tried to establish a colony here called Fort St. Louis. It was a disaster from the beginning. I'm sure many of you know this story. One ship went back to France out of the 3 ships. 2 were sunk in Matagorda Bay, leaving them with no way out, no way to resupply. La Salle himself was murdered by his own men. The colonists remaining back there died by rattlesnake bites and alligator attacks even, inflammation of their throat from eating prickly pear fruit without taking the thorns off. It was a total disaster. And finally, they were overrun. The remaining colonists were overrun and killed mostly by the Karankawas. Among them was a woman named Isabel Talon. And she was one of the colonists who came to France, or to Texas from France with La Salle, looking for a new start. She was the mother of 5 children, and she was one of the people who died in that final attack. The Spanish desperately wanted to find this French thorn, as they called it, and get rid of it, get it out of Spanish Texas, make sure that the rivalry between Spain and France could not continue into Texas. And they sent 4 different, they traveled like for 4 years looking for this colony, finally came across it. And when they found it, it was destroyed. There was nothing left except, timbers and old papers strewn, books strewn all over the place, skeletons here and there. And they found one skeleton that had a blue dress, a tattered blue dress still clinging to it, a skeleton of a woman who was probably Isabel Talon. And there was a man on the expedition named Juan Bautista Chapa who was about 60 years old. He had literary aspirations. And when he saw this dress clinging to this skeleton in this ruined place in the middle of nowhere, he sat down and wrote what I think might be the first poem ever written in Texas. And here's a picture of the Belle, the ship one of the main ship that sank, which you can see today at the Bullitt Museum in Austin. Anyway, Chapa sat down and wrote this poem, and here's how one stanza goes. "Oh, beautiful French women who once walked among these blooming prairie roses and whose hands, white as snow, brushed against the white irises of the fields." He was so moved by the sight of this skeleton and what this woman had been through that he just sat down and this all poured out of him apparently. And I was very moved too when I went to that site that I mentioned, the scraggly meadow, and was assaulted by mosquitoes and nothing to see but lots to feel, lots to sense, and it was just I'd always been interested in Isabel Talon and this poem that seemed to have been written about her. And we were leaving the site, and we went to the Museum of the Coastal Bend in Victoria afterwards, where there's a lot of artifacts left over from Fort St. Louis, including some cannons and drinking cups and stuff like that. And I asked the curator as I was leaving, by any chance, is there anything here that belonged to Isabel Talon? And he said, well, yeah, come on in the back and I'll show you something. And he took me into the back of the museum and took down this archival box that looked kind of like a hat box and opened it up. and inside was her skull. And on the skull, you could see a dent made by a Karankawa war club. And that was such a chilling moment to me to be, face to face is not the right word, but to be next to the actual physical person who was the subject of the first poem ever written in Texas. And those are the kind of experiences that that really thrilled me as I was writing this book. I would come across things like this again and again. This is Parker's Fort, which was established by 5 brothers in the 1830s and on the Navasota River, along the Navasota River. And right after the Battle of San Jacinto in April of 1836, in May of 1836, this fort was attacked, or this family compound was attacked by a group of Comanches and probably Kiowas. And they captured a number of people, including a girl named Cynthia Ann Parker. And she was about 10 years old and was brutally taken from her family, ended up living with the Comanches for 24 years, making a new life with them, marrying the chief Petanacona, having 3 children. Then she was brutally recaptured by a group of Texas Rangers and militia in 1860, 24 years later. And this was a terrible, the second horrible event in her life, particularly because she had one little girl with her named Topsana, but her 2 sons were not there on the Pease River when she was captured. And so she didn't know where they were. And she and Topsana were taken to a family, to relatives who lived on a farm near Fort Worth. She never got over it. She never was able to go back to the life she had had before. And her daughter died as a young girl. Cynthia Ann, mourned in the Comanche way by slicing her arms and bleeding into the earth. She never did learn the language, the English language again. Finally, a guy came who could speak Comanche, and she was so thrilled and desperate to talk to him. And what she told him was, "My heart is crying all the time." And she died herself about 1870, not long after she was recaptured. There are 2 totally indelible, unforgettable photos from Texas history. One is this one, which shows Lyndon Johnson being sworn in on Air Force One after the Kennedy assassination. And you see Jackie Kennedy there to his left, staring with an utter shell-shocked and bewildering look on her face. The other one is this one. This is Cynthia Ann Parker, taken at a Fort Worth photographer's studio a few months after she was recaptured. To me, I could stare at this photo forever, at the blank look on her face, at the fright and terror and bewilderment that echoes in some weird way the look on Jackie Kennedy's face 100 years later. That's her daughter, Topsana, who is nursing at her breast while the photograph is being taken. When Quanah Parker, her son, became the chief of the Comanches, the principal chief of the Comanches, and finally surrendered his band of Comanches to Ranald Mackenzie after they were defeated at the Battle of Palo Duro, his first question to Mackenzie was, "Where's my mother?" And that's really was the story of Cynthia Ann and Quanah Parker. To me, is the story of a son looking for his mother and a mother looking for his son. And he was told he didn't know by Mackenzie that he didn't know where they were, but he later found out when he was the exalted chief of the Comanches on the reservation, who's a friend of Theodore Roosevelt, who owned his own railroad. He finally put ads in newspapers asking anyone if they knew where his mother might be. And finally, he located her bones back in Texas and brought them home to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. And he spoke at her funeral. He said, "Comanche may die today, tomorrow, 10 years. When in comes then they all be together again. I want to see my mother again then. And so they are, as you see now, together in the Fort Sill Cemetery. They finally were reunited, at least in death. This is a courthouse in Eastland County, Texas. It was built in 1897 after the old one was torn down. And while they were building it, there was this guy there who was watching them build it, and he went home, and he was kind of curious, is it true that horny toads or horned lizards or whatever you want to call them can live for a long time without food or water? And he saw his son playing with a little horny toad in the yard, and he said, can I borrow that? And he took the horny toad to the construction site, put him in a hollow cornerstone of the courthouse, and sealed it up, and the courthouse was built, and 31 years later, the courthouse was torn down to build a new one. And everybody gathered at the site to see if it was remotely possible that this horny toad who had been put in there 31 years ago could still be alive. And they opened up the cornerstone. This guy reached in, took out something that looked kind of like a dry leaf, but it started twitching. And somebody said, the darn thing's alive. And indeed, there was a living horny toad either in that cornerstone or by virtue of some sleight of hand. But this horny toad became to me one of the most interesting persons or personas in Texas history, and certainly the most famous horny toad who ever lived. He was the subject of a Titanic custody battle. He was taken to Washington, D.C. to meet Calvin Coolidge, taken back home, where unfortunately he died of pneumonia one day when a norther came in, and the people who had custody of him left him on the screened-in porch. But that's not the end of the story, because a casket maker in Abilene made a special little casket for Old Rip. And I've been telling people all during the pandemic, if you're bored, if you're sick of being in your house, you can't stand it anymore, drive to Eastland, Texas, to the county courthouse, and there you will find Old Rip lying in state. And this is one of the great things to see in our great state. So when I tell people that I was writing a history of Texas, and after I'd finished it, they all wanted to know what I'd learned, what kind of conclusions I'd come to, and why Texans are the way they are, and why is this place and this identity so important to us and so fascinating and sometimes infuriating to people from the other 49 states. Why does a state that sits at the center of the nation choose in some important way to stand apart from it? Partly, it's a simple answer, we were a republic. We were a nation, and not just a republic in the sense that Vermont or California or Hawaii was when they were republics for a time before they were states. But we were a nation for 10 years, and all during that 10 years we were on a constant war footing with Mexico, with the Native Americans that we were trying to push out of Texas. Mexico invaded twice, we invaded them once. So there was a constant aura and sense of conflict that helped forge, I think, an embattled Texas identity. And people ask me if that identity is still alive today, and I say, yeah, just go to Buc-ee's. Look in there and check out all the Texas merchandise, all the racks of coonskin caps. The thing is, you can go to New York and go to Times Square, and there are all these souvenir shops that's selling, replicas of the Statue of Liberty and stuff like that. But the people who buy that stuff are from out of state. The people who buy the Texas schlock at Buc-ee's are from Texas. And, we believe we own this stuff in some real weird way. And when I think about that Texas identity, you know, how strong it is, I think back to the early 1980s when I was writing a piece for Texas Monthly. Actually, it's a piece that I gave up on, it never got finished, but I was in Missouri City, outside of Houston, at an intake center for Vietnamese refugees who were fleeing after the fall of Saigon, who were trying to find a new home. And in that time, about 1975, there were less than 100 Vietnamese in Greater Houston. In the 2010 census, there were more than 80,000. And here's an example of the kind of people who were coming here back then after the fall of Saigon. And I was at this intake center, and there was this little boy. He couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. And his grandmother, who had one of those conical hats and black pajamas, was standing next to him. And somebody had given him a can of Play-Doh to occupy himself. And I just sat there watching what this kid was going to make out of the Play-Doh. And what he made was a water buffalo. And that was, I'm sure, to try to put himself in touch with the home he had left. But just like Isabel Talon, or just like Sam Houston, or Davy Crockett, or George H.W. Bush, here he was in Texas making a new start, which is the story of our state, of all the people who have come here to create this place. And I've thought about that kid ever since. And, you know, he's now certainly a grown man. And I've asked myself, did he become a Texan? Did he grow up somewhere along along Galveston Bay? What business did he get into? Was he a doctor? Was he a restaurant owner? Was he a shrimper? What could he have become? And I asked myself, you know, did he take his kids to the Alamo the same way that my parents took my brother Jim and I to the Alamo in 1955? There we are wearing our Davy Crockett T-shirts and our Davy Crockett shorts. So I'm just going to leave you with this quote from the book, where I try to grapple with this idea of the Texas identity. People viewing Texas from the outside have always recognized there is something different about it, not just in its expanse, but in its attitude, in its annoying, ineradicable, mythic presumption. But it's hard to live here for long and not feel that presumption stirring inside you. So many kinds of people have fought over the geography of Texas for so long and competed for their places in its ever-changing culture that there is a kind of harmony of conflict, a hard-earned conviction that the word Texan belongs as righteously to you as it does to everyone else. And I think that's probably true of that Vietnamese boy and his family. Thank you very much.